Hello and welcome to the AIES podcast, Politics on Point. My name is Sofia-Maria Satanakis. I'm a senior research fellow at the AIES, and this is the fifth episode of our special series on US-Europe relations, supported by the Austrian-American Partnership Fund. In this 7-episode special, we're covering a broad range of different topics relevant to the transatlantic relationship, providing you with perspectives and insights of high-level US experts. This includes, for instance, the future of NATO, the fight against climate change, or the strengthening of democratic values and institutions. Today, we will talk about the US view regarding European security and defense. My guest today is Mr. Benjamin Haddad, the director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. He is an expert in European politics and transatlantic relations, and his area of expertise also includes disinformation, defense policy, populism, and many, many more. A very warm welcome to you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And before we start with the questions, maybe you want to say a few words about yourself, about your work, so that our listeners can get a better picture of who they're going to listen to.
Sure. I'm Ben Haddad. I am based in Washington, D.C., where I'm the director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a major bipartisan think tank policy organization in Washington, D.C. Bipartisan with a mission. We're not neutral, and our mission is really to promote U.S. engagement with allies in the defense of liberal democracy. And at the core of it, of course, is the transatlantic relationship. And at the Europe Center, what we're trying to do is guide U.S. policy when it comes to relations with the EU. We have a ton of programs at the Council, working from the future of NATO to the question of geotechnology, geoeconomics. We have a program working on disinformation, on Latin America, on Africa, and the Europe Center really is on the future of U.S.-EU relations, coming from the defense angle to the question of trade, of the European digital regulatory environment, to, of course, the politics of the European Union.
Wonderful. So you are the best candidate for today's topic. And I'm going to start and jump right in with our first question to you, which would be, what is the general view in the United States regarding European security and defense? And how seriously are European efforts actually taken in this area?
It's a really interesting question, because I think we're witnessing right now sort of a shift among US experts on the question of European defense. Because the truth is, for a long time, European defense efforts were not really welcomed in Washington, where they were seen with a little bit of reluctance. You remember, of course, Madeleine Albright in the 90s warning against the risk of redundancies and duplications between NATO and the burgeoning European defense integration efforts at the time. And we've seen this basically both among Democrats and Republicans, the idea that the ancestors to PESCO and EDF could be a challenge to transatlantic unity and to NATO. And I think this is starting to shift a bit, and we're going to see some of that among in the Biden administration, precisely because there is a view that Europeans should step up their defense efforts, and that the European Union could be a useful vehicle, especially for specific European security interests, defending their interests in their own neighborhood. Now, there's still debates about how that should be done, and I think of course it depends who you talk to. But one thing for sure is that some of the tensions that we've seen in the last few years over the question of burden sharing, of the question of Europeans spending more on defense, will not disappear with Donald Trump. Of course, we'll see an administration, and we'll talk about this today, Biden administration that is much more transatlantic, that's much more friendly towards the European Union than its predecessors. But the question of burden sharing did not start with Donald Trump. We had seen predecessors like Barack Obama had talked about Europeans being free riders of American power. And this is a debate that will continue in the next few years. And so I think you're starting to see a shift in mood, thinking that, maybe Europeans developing their own instruments can be an asset, a value added for the alliance and NATO, as long as it's done in a coordinated way, of course, with NATO and the United States, and the devil is in the detail. We'll talk a little bit about this, but I think you see a new generation, especially among democratic experts, but not limited to that, that is starting to have a different view of this.
Perfect. This shift that you mentioned, it's also in line with the shift that has been occurring within the European Union efforts in the field of integrating more in security and defense. Because if you take a look at the last 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 years, you can see that we have been making a lot of progress. For example, with the Permanent Structured Cooperation, also known as PESCO, the European Defence Fund, and so on and so forth. So how would you assess this development in particular? Are we Europeans going in the right direction, would you say?
Yeah, you're right to mention this. And I think these efforts are indeed going in the right direction. We've seen an awakening, I think, in the last decade coming from Europeans of their fragility, of their vulnerability on the global stage. In the same few years, we've seen a Russian aggression against Ukraine. They've seen a shift of border by force for the first time since World War II on the European continent with the annexation of Crimea. We've seen a refugee crisis that was a consequence of a geopolitical crisis, the war in Syria, in which Europe was completely powerless, completely incapable of shaping its environment with very direct consequences on the European soil, from the refugee crisis to, of course, ISIS-inspired terror attacks. And in this context, we've also seen a U.S. ally that was shaky in its commitment to the alliance and much more hostile towards the European Union. So I think this general feeling of vulnerability, both in the direct neighborhood, but also in the global geopolitical context, pushed Europeans to reawaken to security and defense issues. We've seen first individual countries, for most of them, increase their defense spending in the last few years. And as you mentioned, a flurry of initiatives from the European Defense Fund to PESCO that have been developed. Now, I do think it's going in the right direction, because for all the talk about European weakness, if you look at all the European defense spending put together, Europe is the second defense spender in the world, behind the United States and above countries like Russia. So the real issue we have are the question of redundancies, a lack of coordination among spending. And this is the kind of things that EDF, for example, is trying to solve by promoting common projects among European countries. I do think, though, that this is really not enough. And I think if you look at the increase in defense spending, some of our partners like the United States, but also some of our challengers and competitors like Russia and China are increasing their spending quicker than we are. And at the same time, I think some of the initial ambitions and some of the rhetoric that we had heard has not been matched by the necessary resources and reality. If you take EDF, for example, the initial budget that was supposed to be allocated for it, I think, was 15 billion euros. It was halved in the budget negotiation, and so the European Parliament voted on something that's 7 billion. Once again, a step in the right direction, but way too small a step, I think, for Europe to be able to have any sort of real geopolitical influence in its neighborhood. Just in the last few months, we've seen Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, hijack a plane in the European Union, going from Greece to Lithuania to arrest a journalist and put his life in danger. And here again, I think that the reaction of the European Union to what was directly a challenge on its autonomy and sovereignty was very underwhelming. And we've seen, Europe basically incapable of really reacting to crisis in its environment. So I think it'll take more effort, more unity, more coordination to really be able to match the rhetoric of European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, or what Ursula von der Leyen calls a geopolitical Europe. But at least there has been this sort of awakening to the sense of threat that Europe is facing.
Exactly. And if I may just add one thing, I think this awakening you're mentioning, it was inevitable and also necessary, because of this ring of fire, this ring of instability that is surrounding Europe more and more. But I absolutely agree with you that it's not enough. It's going to take a lot more effort, better coordination. But in generally, as we all know, the European Union is rather slow when it comes to being radical with progress. But maybe I'm wrong here, and in the next couple of years, we'll see more progress and more steps in the right direction, including, which brings me to the next question, participation of third countries in PESCO, because we have now the US participating in the PESCO project of military mobility, which was celebrated as a huge deal, a big deal, something that's very important for both sides of the Atlantic. How would you see this development?
Look, I think first the US participation in military mobility, I think, is welcome. It's also something that's critical to NATO, of course. I mean, these are very concrete things that we're talking about, right? Making sure that you have the same kind of roads and bridges so that, for example, tanks or a military vehicle and equipment can cross from a border to another. This is critical to be able to answer challenges that you can have from rival powers or on your borders. And there's been this ongoing debate over the question of third-party participation for EDF, and it's been a source of transatlantic friction over the last few years. I'm one of the people who think that the US should be much more supportive of European defense efforts, even if sometimes that means that some of the rules might exclude third-party countries or US companies from competing in certain contracts. I think it's much more important strategically for the US to have allies that are able to stand on their 2 feet on defense and security. And sometimes that means promoting their own defense industry. I think it's important first in terms of building the capacities, but it's also important politically. I mean, for a lot of the European countries, increasing defense spending will probably mean having to sacrifice elsewhere. The only way to sell this politically, to sell this to their public opinion, is also to be able to show that these investments will trickle down, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of jobs, in terms of industrial output for the country. So I think, maybe that's a slight opportunity loss for US companies, although, so far, unfortunately, we're not talking about huge sums of money anyway, especially when you compare it to the US defense budget. But I think the value added of having Europeans who are able to be more robust on defense issues is really tremendous for the United States, especially as the US is signaling, and that's something that we've seen with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration is signaling a shift in priorities away from Europe, away from the European neighborhoods, North Africa and the Middle East. And so it puts even more of a burden and urgency on Europeans to be able to defend themselves. So I think it's important. It's important to find an agreement with the US. I think it's important for the US to be a little more flexible on this than it has been so far, and for Europeans to have the ability to have their own defense industry. Of course, you look at the capabilities today, it's impossible for Europeans to be completely autonomous. So no one is talking about a decoupling, both on the strategic level, but also on the industrial level between the US and Europe. It's really the opposite that is happening right now. Even countries like France, which have been advocating very much for more European strategic autonomy, as President Macron calls it, have under Macron acquired US military equipment on, from for example, on some of the equipment on the new French aircraft carrier. So, even the most autonomous European allies, or the ones that are pushing for autonomy, understand the need to work closely with the US defense industry.
A lot of questions are generating from your answers. So I will start with the first that comes to my mind. You mentioned the magic words, European strategic autonomy, which is a much debated concept, not just within the European Union, but also outside of it. So do you see it as, in general and long-term, being beneficial for US-Europe relations?
Yes, I think if we define European strategic autonomy the way European leaders who defend it do it. It's very simply the ability for Europe to be able to act on its own, if necessary, to defend its security and interests, especially in its neighborhood. And it's the direct consequence of the crisis that we've been talking about and we've seen in the last few years, especially at a time where the United States is signaling that it wants Europeans to step up, to increase the defense spending, and to be able to secure part of its neighborhood when the US has different priorities, and especially, of course, the focus on the strategic rivalry with China, which is really something that's bipartisan right now in the United States. It's clearly in the interest of the United States to have strong, united allies rather than weak and divided ones, even if sometimes they might mean disagreements, sometimes it might mean going in sort of different directions, but that still means allies that can bring value added to the table. And that's something that's really the main asset when you think about, the US and you compare it to China, for example. The main asset of the United States is, of course, its allies across the world, both in Europe and in the Pacific. So having strong allies who can defend themselves is really important. There's sometimes, I think, a debate a little bit in bad faith over the meaning of strategic autonomy. And as I said earlier, it's not about decoupling from the United States. I mean, just look at France, for example. The main country that's been pushing for this concept is also an active member of NATO, has a very dynamic bilateral relationship in defense, security, intelligence sharing with the United States that goes from US support with ISR in the Sahel to the coalition against ISIS to a very intense cooperation between intelligence agencies on counterterrorism. So, there's absolutely no contradiction between Europe asserting more of its autonomy and at the same time doing it within the transatlantic relationship.
Exactly. So,
but I would add just one point, though. I think now we're at a point where we've established some of these concepts from European sovereignty, geopolitical Europe, strategic autonomy, and it's interesting to see how much they've shaped the conversation and the debate. I think now there's an expectation to deliver. I think now what's really important is not so much to win the conceptual narrative, is to put the resources and the capabilities and the willingness to act upon them with concrete missions to bolster these concepts. When I talk to friends who are close to the Biden administration, that's what they're expecting now. I think they're pretty agnostic when it comes to concept. There's something good about Americans. They're very pragmatic that way. And Europeans generally like to have long philosophical conversation, a theological conversation. I think now it's important to show both for the citizens of Europe, but also for our allies and partners, that this means concrete capabilities and a capacity to act upon them.
Summing up, you would say that American leaders should respond to a more integrated EU defense pillar by being more supportive? Do you think they should kind of push the Europeans to do more, to exert some kind of pressure? What would you say?
Yeah, all of the above. I really think that they should embrace European defense integration efforts, and they should embrace the European Union in general. I think President Biden did it very well when he was both in Cornwall and then in Brussels, where he said, a strong EU and united EU is in the interest of the United States. That's been a bipartisan position for half a century in the United States. EU is the ability to promote liberal democracy and free trade and peace, of course, on the European continent. And it's no mistake that for a long time, EU and NATO expansion have sort of gone hand in hand. Although they're quite different, but still, there has been this momentum in the 90s and the 2000s going in that direction. And I think especially now is a time where the US priority will be focused on China. Look at what is the strategic rivalry with China about? If we put aside defense issues for a second, it's also about what kind of globalization do we want? What are the rules of trade? What are the norms and standards on the use of technology and digital issues? And that's something on which clearly you want to have the European Union on your side, the main the premier integrated single market in the world, the first a norm and standard setter on technology, on trade, on the environment, of course, it's going to be a major asset for the United States to be able to work with the EU at the WTO, work with the EU in setting the norms and standards on the international basis. I think one of the successes of the president's visit to Brussels was precisely the announcement of the creation of this Trade and Tech Council between the United States and Europe, where we can not only address some of the differences that we have on these issues, but also try to shape standards together from AI to 5G and all of these supply chains and all of these matters. I think that will be really critical.
Very well. Let's stay a little bit on the topic of Joe Biden, Donald Trump, because you mentioned both of them a couple of times. And I also have a question related to that. Now we came out of 4 years of Trump presidency, which we unfortunately know that did not go so well for the transatlantic relationship. And now that we have Joe Biden, kind of hope was restored within the European countries to some point. Do you think that under President Biden, the transatlantic relationship will be restored? And what could that actually mean for European integration efforts in security and defense? Is that also a risk of Europeans getting more comfortable again now that we have a more friendly leader towards the EU?
Well, I don't think we should look for a restoration. I think we should look for a renovation and think about how we can reshape the transatlantic relationship to take stock of the last few years, but also address the challenges that both sides of the Atlantic are now facing. First, it's important to draw the lessons of the Trump years. Yes, there was clearly something very specific about President Trump himself personally, about the tweets and the scandals, about what led to January 6th. But it's also important to see how he was a continuation and an accelerator of pre-existing trends. I mean, I talked about the backlash against military interventions that we see in the United States, both on the left and the right. And look at President Biden. One of his first major decisions was to confirm the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and President Obama had withdrawn the troops from Iraq, and of course famously refused to intervene in Syria with the direct security consequences that it had in Europe. I mentioned also the question of burden sharing. I think Trump, really focused obsessively on the 2% defense spending threshold, and of course we want to have a more sophisticated conversation about burden sharing and defense and capabilities. But this is not something that started with Trump, and it won't end with him. So I think you have, and the focus, of course, on the strategic rivalry with China is something that is not only confirmed but accelerated by the Biden administration. Same thing for some of the reluctance over free trade. It's important to remember that it's not always noted that President Biden has not lifted the Trump tariffs on steel and aluminum. Because he knows that there's also some disputes over trade. There's also a lot of backlash here, again, both on the left and on the right against free trade and some of the legacy of the 90s. And I think Biden sort of intuitively understands this very well. So, it's important to look at some of the trends. And to your question about whether there's a risk that Europeans might become too comfortable, I do think there's a risk. And I think here, of course, European leaders have a responsibility, but in the United States too. The atmospherics and the images of Biden's trip to Brussels were very positive, and that's something to be applauded. I mean, rebuilding trust among leaders and also among public opinions is important. But now we have to move to the next step. We have to move beyond just the rhetoric of America is back and ask ourselves, what do we want from the transatlantic relationship, and how can we reshape it in a more innovative way? And I think this is an opportunity now to have a frank conversation among friends and allies, not in a hostile way like we had the last 4 years, but still a frank conversation where we ask ourselves, what do we expect from one another? What does the United States not want to do anymore where Europeans can step up? With the kinds of missions or the kinds of theaters, especially in the European neighborhood, where the US is expecting Europeans to step up. I'll be this week in the Western Balkans. This is a region where I think, clearly there are some unresolved issues from some of the conflicts of the 90s, where Europe has a responsibility. You have a lot of countries that are either on the accession path to the European Union or hoping to be candidates to the European Union, like Albania and North Macedonia. This is, I think, typically a region where Europe, we're talking about geopolitical Europe, where Europe needs to assert its influence, needs to be more involved politically and economically. And for a long time, it was a region where actually the United States was, in a way, more present than the European Union. So I think there are lots of issues where it's time to have a serious transatlantic conversation, and the United States must ask Europeans to take on more responsibility.
Exactly. And regarding the Western Balkans, this is also of huge strategic importance for a country like Austria, even though we're not NATO members, we're a neutral country, but we're very interested in the integration, in the European integration of the Western Balkans. So this is also something where Austria could, as a European country, as an EU member state, kind of push towards the right direction. So, changing the subject a little bit, because one cannot talk about European security and defense without mentioning NATO, and this is what we're going to do now. Would you say that a more integrated European security and defense would mean a strengthening of NATO in the long term?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think for me, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. I mean, we're so far from the debate of the 90s where people worried about duplication. I mean, first, let's look at the dialogue between the EU and NATO. It's been strengthened, it's been upgraded in the last 2 decades. You have a lot of mechanisms of coordination that make sure that if Europeans are spending in one direction, that's also something that is an asset and a value added for NATO. So I think it's really time to completely overcome the reluctance over this. It's in the interest of NATO and the United States to see Europeans increasing the defense spending, to see Europeans coordinating their defense and security efforts and developing their own perspective on security and defense issues, so we can have the most complementary efforts on both sides.
Thank you very much for that answer. And now moving on to another hot topic, which cannot go by without being mentioned, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So would you see COVID-19 as having a serious long-term impact on security and defense in general, and also on European efforts especially? Is there some kind of risk of backsliding, of investments being reduced, of stagnation in the long term?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's a couple of risks. The first risk is, of course, the fact that as governments had to considerably step up their spending efforts to unprecedented levels to be able to answer the huge economic hit of the lockdowns and the pandemic. Of course, there's a risk that other kinds of spending, such as defense spending, are sacrificed on the altar of the economic recovery. And that's something that we're going to see, I think, in both the United States and the European Union. And that's the first risk. But one way to mitigate that risk is actually to continue to increase coordination and integrated European defense efforts. Because as I said, I mean, beyond just the question of spending, if you look at the global spending of the European Union, it's actually very high. The question is, how can you make sure that you coordinate and you can leverage each other's spending to be a stronger military power? That's one thing. I would say it's a second aspect beyond just the defense and security dimension is not to forget that there's a geopolitical dimension to some of COVID-19, especially some of the recovery efforts. I just mentioned the Western Balkans. In the Western Balkans, a lot of the initial vaccines that were sent were Sinopharm, the Chinese vaccines. And we've also seen Russia step up with exports of Sputnik, the Sputnik vaccine. Actually, Russia even exported its vaccine before giving it to its own citizens, which really shows the priorities here of the Kremlin. It's very important as we go into a long economic recovery and a health recovery, actually, because COVID is not over. If you look at the fourth wave that's starting to hit the European Union, it's very important that we don't stay inward looking, only focused on ourselves, but also remember that rival powers are stepping up, and that you have more risk of countries being indebted to China for their recovery. So this is why also I think some of the announcements on a massive European transatlantic EU-US development efforts that were announced after the president's trip were really welcome, and I think now it's time to operationalize these. But because there's a geopolitical dimension to this that's undeniable.
Exactly, and one should not forget that as devastating and as terrible as the pandemic has been and continues to be, that does not mean that the risks and the challenges in the international arena are going to cease to exist, or that they're going to pause until Europe and the United States are ready to tackle them. So we need to multitask, I would say. Before we come to an end of today's episode, as a concluding question to you, maybe what would you think are the main things you want to see in the next years happening when it comes to European security and defense? What would you wish for?
Look, I mean, I think we need to continue the efforts we've been doing when it comes to spending on defense, when it comes to coordination on different projects. But I also think that we should just be a little more ambitious in what we hope to achieve, especially in our environment. I mentioned earlier Belarus, because this is an example that really struck me. You have a hijacking of a plane. You have now weaponized migration at the border between Belarus and Lithuania. If you want to be a geopolitical Europe, you have to understand the threat. You have to understand a challenge when it's coming to you, and you have to respond in kind, or only to send a message. And that's something that I think is not yet in the software of European leaders. And it doesn't have to be the 27 deciding together. I think sometimes, this debate about unanimity rule versus qualified majority is a good pretext for individual countries not to act. I think you could have groupings of states or individual states taking responsibility to defend European security. It's what we've seen, for example, with France and Greece working together in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Turkey was sending a ship to challenge the maritime sovereignty of some European states like Cyprus and Greece. So there's also a question beyond just a question of capacities or spending, or there's a question of politics, of taking responsibility and being able to respond to challenges. So I think that's something that's really important, that will have to continue to change in the mindset of Europe if Europeans want to be able to shape their environment and defend their own security. And the second thing, so that was really directed at Europeans. And for Americans, I think let's have a frank conversation at the transatlantic level, as I mentioned earlier, on what we expect from one another, and have the US not only embrace European defense efforts, but also have a strategic conversation about where we think Europeans should step up, where we can have a better allied coordination, where the United States can stay more in support. A good example of this for me has been the last few years in the Sahel, where Europeans were taking the lead against terrorism, with support, both political but also intelligence support from the United States, in a mission that was clearly in U.S. interest, in transatlantic interest, in the global U.S. war against terrorism. But at least you had allies that were leading. That could be. It's not a perfect mission, of course, and France is withdrawing from part of it. But at least I think the way we think about it in terms of complementarity between the allies is a good precedent here.
Exactly. I would say, to summarize, be more ambitious and be more frank with one another in order to find ways to make it work. Those are very relevant and very nice concluding words. And I thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your insights and your expertise with us. It was an absolute pleasure to listening to your compact answers. And I hope it was also a pleasure from your side to talk to us today.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Thank you so much.